set about bringing water from a river 20 miles away. They cut the trenches, they negotiated, and went across roads and other people's land. And today that village, and there are good numbers of other villages, have now got a regular water supply. And what difference has that made? It meant that people were better off because they grew more crops. They grew more crops so they could sell more. They had more income coming in. Young men who had given up hope because a village was not a place of hope and they'd migrated, either returned or stayed in the village. I was there with a friend of mine, and she'd been there 2 years before, and as we sat in the church and the people came in, she said to me, "These people are different. Look at the women." She said they walk as if they're in charge of themselves. They're better clothed. And it had worked its way through the community. And I thought it was a wonderful example of Christian self-help, but self-help aimed at helping the community in which they lived. Another man that I met there and chatted to was a man who had got 3 cows. And he said, "But we've got gas in the house." So I said, "Well, how did you do that?" He said, "I got a book and I read about turning the waste from the cows into methane gas." And he took me into his little kitchen and he said, "We'll have a cup of tea." And he turned on the gas and it came from a slurry pit not far from his house, based on his 3 cows. Now, this was not a man, he was literate. I think I might have been able to do it if I'd found a book and some help. But he got on and done it. I thought, great, this is something which is really remarkable. That's the kind of development that's going on all over Africa. The example that I gave from the Diocese of Kenya, Mount Kenya East, has been taken all over Africa: Rwanda, Burundi, Tanzania, Angola, and other countries. So it's got an impulse, and it does give people a sense of belonging and a sense of future within their own communities. And that does seem to me to be very important, whereas a lot of development has been top down. And development, of course, cannot provide jobs for everybody. It provides jobs for a handful of people because it's high tech. What about energy? Methane gas, yes, well, that's on a small scale. Africa, south of the Sahara, has got high level of resources but low level of supply. In other words, there are all kinds of ways of generating hydroelectric power, but also solar energy. And I don't know how hopeful you are for some great breakthrough with batteries and solar energy, so that we have a second revolution, a bit like the invention of, say, the steam engine or the internal combustion engines. It's not my field of expertise, but I'm an optimist. And when I think that there were things that people scratch their heads about, say, longitude, and how you would work out good navigational aids to tell you where you were in the world. And then there were people who scratched their heads to say, how do we get water out of a fairly deep coal mine? And then there were people who said, well, how can we move goods more speedily around the country? And they came up with canals and turnpikes. And then someone said, how about taking a stationary engine and putting wheels on it and calling it a locomotive? And you have the transformation of modern economies during that fairly long period that is often referred to as the Industrial Revolution. Well, is there another one? You live in the biomedical, biochemical century, perhaps. Perhaps this is one of the offshoots. But there's a lot of space for renewables in Africa, and a considerable amount of effort that's being put into it. The problem when you build dams, and we see this with some of the large dams on the Nile, and more are being built, is that you run into riparian problems with your neighbours downstream, Sudan, Egypt, whatever. And also that you can't control silting, and you end up with very expensive piece of equipment which generates electricity, but also does nasty things to the river. Solar power, well, possibly. There are people who now have computers with a solar panel, and that's what they rely on, and they're in touch with the world. And I have seen farmers dressed in what appears to be some rather rough old clothes, herding their cattle in places like Kenya. And suddenly they would dive into their pocket and pull out a cell phone and check the stock markets in Nairobi. Now, that's a fascinating area. It has gone across Africa like wildfire. And people who didn't know how to work them, hadn't got them, now have them. And are using them, and they're using them commercially as well. Bioenergy, of course, is a threat. The man who delivered charcoal to our house, which we didn't want, we were happy to have the fish that his neighbour, or the oranges that his neighbour brought. But the charcoal came from forests. The larger the population, the more charcoal is required if you're going to use bioenergy, and the more forests are going to be disappeared. In certain parts of sub-Saharan Africa, they have armed guards to protect the forests from people cutting them down. What about states and government? Because that's quite important. Most states in Africa are not nation states in the sense that they are in Europe. And of course, even in Europe, thankfully, we're all getting mixed up more and more. So that we've got rich diversity. Just looking around this room is a wonderful example of that. People from different continents and different backgrounds. And Africa has got ethnic diversity, but that sometimes does lead, again, to competition for scarce resources, and thus ethnic or communal conflict. There have been attempts by certain groups of people to secede from the nation state which was created at independence, which after all was largely based on colonial frontiers that were drawn in the chancelleries of Europe, they might have been sort of tarted up by people on the ground, but you only have to look at a little bit of the history to see that it didn't make a lot of difference, and it divided communities and people, and particularly people who came from the same ethnic group who spoke the same language. But there are also failed states which have disintegrated, fallen apart. And the result in places like Somalia,